Okay. All right, everyone. My name is Dominique Hammonds, and I will be talking with you this morning about broaching. And hopefully, this will be a really fun discussion. I am leaning on our group this morning. Although I see that we have a smaller group than expected, I think this might work in our favor because that means that we can have some more open dialogue, and I'll have an opportunity to hear from you more specifically. So Sabrina and Cassie, or I think it's Cassie, that's my assumption, but folks in the room, please chime in as we walk through our material today. And I want to learn about your experiences, and particularly some of the challenges you may have experienced and how you've attempted to solve those challenges. I want to learn about some of your success stories as well. And we have some space at the end of our presentation for a case study today. So we're going to talk through how we might work with the client that I've prepared for us today. Okay, so we've got a lot to cover in the time that we have, and I'm looking forward to a fun couple of hours with you all. Okay. All right. And I'm also trying to manage, I want to make sure I can see you in addition to the screens that I have up. So I'll be switching back and forth. Thanks for your patience as I do that. Okay, so a little bit about me. I am an associate professor at Appalachian State University. I'm also the current president of the North Carolina Counseling Association. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor, clinical supervisor, and I conduct research that focuses on multicultural counseling and supervision, creative pedagogies, and technology in counseling. And specifically, I love to focus on telemental health counseling. That's something that I spent a lot of time, particularly I would say in the last year or so, talking about, writing about, because of how relevant that area of research has become. So anyhow, that's a bit about me and my background, my interest in in this material that I'll be talking about this morning. I also, I try to use a culturally informed approach in my teaching, in my supervision, and in my counseling. And I think that from my experience really helps to improve working rapport and helps to improve just counseling outcomes overall. So we'll talk about some of the benefits of why cultural competence, why is this important, why are we talking about this, but we'll get there. This is what we'll be doing with our time. We'll start by exploring counselor values and their impact on the counseling process. We'll then move to discussing broaching basics in ways to overcome the barriers of broaching behaviors. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be pulling on you all, hey, what are some of the challenges that you've had? And I'll explore some common barriers that we hear a little bit in the research. And we'll talk about your experiences as we get into the thick of it. My hope is that we can practice some new skills by exploring a case study that I have developed for you all today. And then we'll conclude by holding some space for discussion and questions. How does that sound? All right, seeing some nodding heads. That sounds good. Lovely. Okay, getting into it then. Culturally competent practice. What does she mean by that? My guess is you've heard this phrase before, but we're going to spend some time and just pause here to talk about what is it, why it's important, right? So a culturally competent counselor considers all aspects of a client's worldview when selecting treatment approaches. That's particularly important because we want to make sure that we are choosing what we're doing, how we're doing it in a way that's appropriate for the person, the unique individual that's sitting in front of us at that particular time, right? No approach is one size fits all, nor should it be. And even though we've got some evidence-based approaches, we know what those are, we also want to be very, very aware of how we apply the approaches and how those applications might affect our individual clients, right? So counselors also need to be aware of their own personal biases, beliefs, and attitudes while providing services. Let me check in with you all. Why is this important? Why do we care about our own values, biases, beliefs? Why do we care about selecting the individual treatment so that it matches the client that we're working with?
You can tell her I can't.
Got Kathy over here. She said that's our ethical mandate.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a big one, right? It is important because our our ethical mandate says it's important, right? ACA, our ethical code says, hey y'all, we need to be paying attention to this. And if we don't, it could be dangerous to our clients. We could be doing them a disservice, and we could be, frankly, putting ourselves at risk as the practitioners, right? So that's one area or reason. Anything else come to mind?
We can't escape our biases. So if we're not aware of them, they're going to affect us either way.
Yes, yes. So I hear that it's important to acknowledge that our biases are present, and they may always be something that just exists in the back of our mind. We're aware that we are probably, all of us, I don't even want to say probably, all of us were raised with some bias, right? We carry it. And we just have to acknowledge what it is and how it might impact our work, so that we can then act accordingly. We can intentionally counteract or be aware of that bias. But if we don't know about it, we don't think about it, we don't pay attention at all, guess what? It's not that it's not there, it's operating without our knowledge, and that's what's dangerous. Eek, right? So thank you so much for your contributions. Absolutely, that is what's dangerous. Okay. Changing demographics. And you may have heard some of this already, but I'm going to remind you. So the US residents that identify as non-white, we've been seeing a steady increase of folks in this category, these categories really, for a while now. And between 2000 and 2010, the increase went from 31% to 36%. Imagine what that number is now from 2010 to 2020, right? Again, that steady increase is really important. Ethnic minorities are projected to become the numerical majority in the US sometime between 2041 and 2046, right? That is a staggering, that's a staggering statistic. Something for us really to pay attention to and to think intentionally about how this impacts what we do in our profession. Particularly those of us who are practicing now, but also are engaged in the profession as counselor educators or supervisors, right? This is important for us for multiple reasons, because we have to be thinking about how are we training our students, our counselor trainees, to move forward, knowing that this is our future. We cannot ignore this, right? So obviously, the percentage of ethnic minorities in the US is projected to continue to rise, right? That is important to us. We need to be paying attention to this, right? So culture and counseling, right? I found a statistic from the American Psychological Association, but it was much more difficult for me to find something specifically put out by ACA. But I did find this, and hopefully this will give us a comparable, something to at least compare our experience as counselors. But APA says that in 2016, around 84% of therapists in the United States identified as white. And there you see a simple breakdown of the other percentage. So 4% Asian, 5% Black, 5% Hispanic, and 2% other, right? Thinking about this, what does this mean for what we do? Not only what we do, but I'm curious, this stat I found on the internet. So what does this mean for clients that are searching and research, and they're coming across these same statistics, right, that are out there? And there are a lot of, I would say, misconceptions, fears, sort of historically founded stereotypes, or just hesitancies, right, about going to doctors, about people who are kind of associated with the medical field, even though I know We are we don't use the medical model, but people who are clients and kind of just trying to get their feet wet, so to speak, into, well, what is counseling? Is this for me? They're doing some research on the internet and saying this exact same thing, right? So what do you think this might tell them? There might feed some hesitance around, some hesitance that they might have around, can they be understood? Will they find a counselor that is sensitive to their cultural needs or values? And I would say, yeah, you can find a counselor who can be culturally sensitive and who can practice in a culturally competent way. However, you got to ask questions, right? So that's things I always tell people when they're in the search for a counselor, right? No counselor is one size fits all either. I think it's important to just acknowledge that and empower our clients to say, you get to ask questions of the person that you're going to sit with and get a sense of if they'll be a good fit for you. So as we audition them, they get to audition us too. All right, so back to the matter at hand. A little bit of a detour, but back to the matter at hand. There are changing demographics that we cannot deny out in our broader society, but also our counseling field, right? So counseling programs are reading the same research and recognizing, hey, we need to be training and really recruiting counselors that identify as our world identifies as, right? We don't want to be so homogeneous in that a large part of the trained professionals in our field identify in these specific ways, right? We want our field to reflect our world, right? So we're making efforts to diversify the counseling field, increase diversity of the students in our counseling programs, which will then, of course, trickle down to the counseling field. And then hopefully this will increase the likelihood of, well, let me backtrack a second. Because of the changing demographics, even if you don't identify as a person of color, you are likely to experience a counseling dyad where the person that you're sitting with does not identify like you, right? Given the changing demographics of our world, no matter who you are, that's likely to be the case. And we have to be intentional about learning about other cultures and bringing up these topics in the work that we do. Hence broaching. That's what I'm getting there. So yeah, okay. Also, one of the things that keeps coming up though in training, also just based on self-report, we keep hearing people say, yeah, we're understanding all these facts, and yet in my program there may have been minimal training received about multicultural counseling. So we know this, and it's still been really difficult to capture all of the things that we feel like we need to capture in the time that we have to capture it. And even if you feel like you've got a solid foundation as far as your training in your program, we often hear new counselors report, oh my gosh, I'm really nervous about doing this, right? Yeah, I read the books. My professor did a really good job of X, Y, or Z, but I'm still really nervous. This is something that there's some discomfort around, and I'm kind of scared to broach, to ask these questions, to bring these things up in the counseling space. So am I off target here, or have you heard some of those things from your own peers, from people that you've worked with, maybe even in your own reflections? I'm seeing some nodding heads. Yeah. Absolutely. So this is an important thing to be aware of. I think it's also, goodness, as I was looking through some of the literature, what I keep coming across is that interesting stats about the disparities. So this is talking about the counseling field, but then how does this impact the people that we work with, right? So this perhaps hesitance to talk about culture in counseling, how does that impact our clients, right? What we tend to see is it may mean that clients are less likely to return to counseling, or less likely to even begin, like start at session 1, because they've heard from so and so, they've heard from a friend, they're hearing these experiences, perhaps horror stories even, that other people have had, and then they're like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to pay to waste my time to be disrespected and not heard, right? I don't want that thing. I don't want to hear that about my field, right? About what we work so hard to not be, to not represent, but yet we keep hearing. So I think this topic is so important, right? Mm-hmm. So what do you need? What do you need from this time? I'll ask you, what challenges have you faced related to culturally competent practice?
I always have to learn more. There's always someone that I don't have a background.
Yeah. So I think I heard just to learn more. There's always something that perhaps you don't know, which I would absolutely agree. Me too, right? Our world is constantly changing. Cultures grow and shift, and there's new language and terminologies and experiences to learn about all the time. And so it seems like it takes a continual commitment to growing and changing. We can't just get to a point where we're like, all right, world, counseling field, I've arrived, and I can now proclaim, this is me proclaiming, I can now proclaim that I am a rubber stamp, right? Culturally competent counselor. No. And if any of you have said that, that would make me worried for you, right? It really does take a commitment to growth and change. All right. So I hear, I just want to continue to grow. Any other thoughts? Any other particular challenges that you may have experienced? Okay. Don't worry. Now is not your only opportunity. So if there's something else that comes up and you think about it, please let me know as we continue to discuss, okay?
We have a comment here from Sabrina, actually.
Okay.
She said, even as a Black woman, I have sometimes struggled to connect with Black male clients. I also have to become a student related to spiritual/religious clients that don't identify with the religious majority. So cultural competence goes beyond race and ethnicity.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And Sabrina, thank you so much for sharing your experience. You know, as someone who may identify as a person of color, you may not be immune from the experience of still needing to learn about people's identities, intersecting identities, experiences that are different from your own, right? So just it is a learning experience no matter who you are, how you identify, right? That's an important one. And I also heard you acknowledge that there may be some things that you're less familiar with, perhaps, and everybody has that same experience. As someone who may identify as Christian, you may be less familiar with people who identify as a different religion, right? And just taking the time to learn about their experiences, to hear about perhaps their experience of marginalization around how Christianity tends to be centralized in the US, right? There's so many things to explore there, right? And it may take getting outside of your own box to see that. That's important. Thank you so much, Sabrina. Any other thoughts? Okay. This is great. So we'll continue. All right. So there may be some and there's probably more, but I picked 3 things to discuss for cultural factors impacting counseling that can impact counseling. One thing that we see in the literature revolves around cultural match. So sometimes you may hear folks talking about, actually bringing it back to what Sabrina said, right? Sometimes it may feel, I won't say easier, but more comfortable to work with clients who identify in similar ways as you identify. And in particular, clients of color tend to perceive white counselors to be less empathetic, respectful, and congruent. Ooh, right? That one kind of hits you a little bit. And I wonder, and I did notice some reactions even in our Zoom room here today, right? That sits with you in a particular way. I wonder if I could just pull on those of you who are with me now. How did that hit you?
It stings a little bit. I don't want to be perceived that way ever. But it's also very real that that could happen. And it seems like a pretty likely possibility.
And in all reality, right, it probably has a lot to do with, well, very little to do with you individually, but more to do with systemic issues, historical factors, right? And so understanding that and acknowledging that in the counseling room will be very important. And how do you do that, right? So these are the layers that we're building on as you begin to broach, right? It's understanding that all of these things are present. They just are. Whether we want to acknowledge them or not, they're there with us. And it's better to just get it out there. Right? So we'll talk a little bit about how you might do that later on. But I really appreciate you all just sharing your initial response to that, because it can sting a little bit. Continuing, white privilege. Failure to acknowledge a client's cultural perspective. But particularly, where does the privilege come in there? If you identify as a member of the dominant culture or as white, your client, even if you don't actually identify as that, if your client perceives that you could identify as someone who is a member of the majority, then there's a perception that you have the power to impose cultural values from the dominant group onto them, right? So if you believe this, if you believe, and we're going to talk about some culture bound values in a few slides, but those value systems may be in the room, right? And how could that impact your dynamic? So many things to think about. And lastly, cultural humility. So really what this is, it's a dynamic and a lifelong process focusing on self-reflection and personal critique, acknowledging one's own biases. Earlier, we talked about how growth is a continual lifelong process. And I think this maps onto this definition very nicely, right? A dynamic and lifelong process focusing on self-reflection, personal critique, and acknowledging one's own biases. So this is something where you have to get out of your bubble. I'm going to probably use that term a lot today, but get out of the bubble that is yours and acknowledge that it is yours, right? It's much like showing a fish water, like explaining to a fish what water is. How do you do that, right? If it's been something that's always been part of your experience, and everywhere you look, that is still part of the experience. Everyone you know has that same experience. And then how do you explain it? It doesn't make sense to someone until you realize, wait, that's my bubble. There are other bubbles. And so it seems easier said than done, because that's probably one of those things you learned in elementary school. Okay, acknowledge that this is my experience. My life is very different from other people's. And yet, I think sometimes where we get stuck is acknowledging, I'll talk more about this in another slide, but acknowledging how value systems and thought processes can also be impacted by that. So it's not just, hey, my life is different from that person's life. It's how we think may be impacted, and then how that person makes choices based on those thoughts and values may also be different, which doesn't make them any less or better. It just makes them different. Right? Oh, that. What can that look like? Where does the rubber meet the road? Especially in counseling. We'll get there. Okay. And again, where we might get in trouble is the unacknowledged impact of counselor values and biases. Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's a good way to begin that self-reflection process. And it's first just by checking in, right? Doing some exploration. I won't give us time to answer these questions today, but at the end of this presentation, I know that I think you'll have a copy of this, or you will be shared this information. I recommend, okay, good. Was that true? I recommend that you go back and answer some of these questions, right? Even write them down and just really think through, what lens do you bring to the world? What is your definition of culture? With which cultural groups or identity dimensions do you primarily identify with, right? What cultural values, beliefs, or attitudes do you hold? And how do those fit into the dominant culture? How did you learn about your cultural values? What has been your experience of other cultures? And what has been your perception of these cultures? So these are a lot of in-depth questions that I think will be really important for you to sit down and walk through. If you've got a learning buddy, someone who is a peer or another practitioner, and you tend to talk through some of these things with, this would be a really good opportunity for you to have a fun conversation with them. Like, say, hey, let's talk about this. And if you do choose to talk through these things with a peer, I'll celebrate that, because this will give you some practice expressing your values in a way that's out loud. It's easier to write them down when you know you're the only one that's going to be reading it. But when you start broaching, you may have to just get a little bit more comfortable expressing those things to someone else, right? And you get some practice hearing how it sounds to someone else. Okay. All right. Looking around, I see some heads nodding. That's good. So we'll keep going. All right. So yes, we're going to make some space to explore your own counselor values. Okay. And earlier, just a few slides ago, I said, remember, it's like showing a fish water and then getting a sense of, okay, well, this is my water, right? And there are other bubbles. And what does that look like? And where we get in trouble is not acknowledging how our values and biases can impact the work that we do. I think it's important to pause here. Okay, so before we jump into this, I want us to take a deep breath, because I realize there are some words on this slide that very commonly get some reactions, and those reactions come from the words white supremacy. I'm gonna put it out there. It's on the slide. All right, it's there. You see it, feel the feels, whatever that means to you, but it is important to walk through. So white supremacy is the idea or ideology that white people and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. All right, so just sit with that. That's a definition, right? And often passive participation or perpetuation of these values or cultural norms can impact our view, I'm saying that on purpose, because whether you identify as white or not, this overall cultural dominance, this value system has impacted all of us, right? So this cultural system has impacted what we see as normal, right? Our ideas of client successes or failures, professional counseling relationships and how we view those, ideas about leadership, hierarchy, dominance, and defensiveness. Let that sink in for a second. So I'm going to pause again, take some deep breaths. What reactions do you have to the language that you see here, white supremacy culture?
I still get angry at white men and the historic background in counseling, just focused through the white male lens. And then I would, when I was in my master's program, looked around at my diverse class and I thought, well, crap.
Mm-hmm.
It's more than just that, but it's that, 100-fold for my colleagues.
Yes.
Now what?
Mm-hmm. Wow. So there's some anger, there's some curiosity, there's some mixed feelings. Okay, that this conjures. What about for others?
This slide personally was interesting for me because previously, you think it's a very clear-cut definition of what white supremacy culture is. It either is or it isn't. But when you really sit down and think about it, it's hard to, how do I phrase this? It's easy for it to be so small that you can't realize it until you actually sit there and analyze a situation.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's not, when we hear white supremacy, I think it can be easy to think, okay, that only applies to very blatant actions or beliefs that intentionally harm or endanger the physical well-being of certain groups. That's not true, right? It is more granular than that. It is these ideas that penetrate essentially everything that we do, right? And how we view a number of large systems, beliefs, patterns that, oh goodness, that impact our field, that impact the medical field, that impact education, that impact lending, that impact housing. I mean, a number of things, right? And so, yeah, it is sort of mind-boggling when you really break it down in those ways. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? Okay.
I like that word mind-boggling. I think that encompasses what I'm feeling of there's so much I'm unaware of.
Mm-hmm. Mind-boggling. Yes, I like the word too. Believe me, we're going to continue to use it because I think we're just going to break it down even more from here. And it will be mind-boggling. It just is, right? And I thank you all for going on this journey with me this morning. I bet you probably didn't think you were going to get this at like 9:30 in the morning on a Thursday morning. Here we go. Got your coffee. So yeah. What I think is really important to take away from this slide is that you don't have to consciously or intentionally oppress others or even believe that you as an individual are superior to another individual or group of people to be impacted by white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture, because of how pervasive it has been, the historical hold that it has on our society, it has infiltrated all of our systems, right? That's the first thing to acknowledge. And once we acknowledge that, then we can see, oh, wow, that's what it is. And there it is, and there it is, and there it is. Right? And then even on a more micro level, so beyond systems, what does that look like between you and the person that you're sitting with in the room? How are those cultural biases, those beliefs about normality or beliefs about what things should be, how is that present? And how does that impact how you view their actions, beliefs, behaviors from a clinical lens? That's where the rubber meets the road. Right? Okay, so these values, beliefs about the dominant culture, they've somehow become synonymous with what is right, with what's normal, and how things should be. That's what's meant by white supremacy culture. And in these next couple of slides, we're going to explore some of these values and beliefs and how they're associated with this white supremacy culture idea. Okay, so get your coffee. Okay, here are some values associated with white supremacy culture. Perfectionism. And that's really the focus on errors or mistakes. So there's often a little appreciation for the labor that goes into work, or there's a hyper focus on product rather than the process. Mistakes are seen as personal, and there must mean that you are doing or you personally are wrong. Okay, let that sink in for a second. Sense of urgency, right? Also associated with white cultural norms. Continued sense of urgency in the professional supervision or counseling setting that makes it difficult to be inclusive and encourage democratic or thoughtful decision making, to be long-term, or to consider consequences. Any thoughts about sense of urgency or perfectionism and how they might be associated with white supremacy culture? Okay, just thinking about it, letting it roll around for now. Okay. Defensiveness or the protection of power. So structures are kind of set to try and protect power as it exists, right? Rather than kind of really massaging, letting the best outcome come forth from a situation. Questioning, criticism, or challenging ideas is seen as threatening, inappropriate, or rude. And if that happens within the context of a counseling setting, the counselor might likely respond with defensiveness. Why? How dare you challenge me? I'm the person in power. You shouldn't do that. I see some shaking heads like, what? No. Okay. Quantity over quality. Producing measurable goals. Anti-process. All resources are directed toward producing measurable cognitive outcomes, more highly valued than non-cognitive traits such as labor, persistence, reflection, compassion. What are your thoughts about that one? You see how this might relate to things that we do? Yeah. Okay, all right, I'm seeing some reactions here. Okay, we'll keep going and then we'll do a general reflection. Individualism. You've probably talked about this one before, but responsibility of change that relies with the individual only, and it discounts collectivism and shared methods of meaning making, right? When we talk about change in counseling, often we say, what are you going to do about it? And of course, I know that, yeah, you can only work with the person in the room, but sometimes we discount how some people who may have a more collectivistic value system may also lean on those around them to help create that change, right? To help support that change. Right to comfort. This is the belief that the person in power has a right to emotions and psychological comfort. And often what happens is scapegoating those who cause discomfort. So I'm the person in power, you're the person maybe coming to me, or if you are seeing this same pattern within your client's own experience, it may be dismissing the other person's perspective because you are centralizing theirs. Like, oh, well, that person, they must be the person wrong, and they are causing you discomfort. That means, right, that they need to go away. Well, what if that's not the case? What if my client perhaps is bringing me something that is, I actually need to work on? They're bringing me some helpful feedback, and yet it is causing me discomfort. What if I actually held that instead of dismissing it because they're not the one in power? Okay, so walking through here. Other culture-bound values. Communication, right? Standard English. There's a written tradition that we typically have. Direct eye contact and limited physical contact. This could, of course, vary depending on your value system, right? Just acknowledging those differences. Time. There's a strict adherence to rigid time. And time is viewed as a commodity. Like, all right, this amount of time equates to this amount of dollars, or whatever you're trading this time for. Progress or, oh, Siri said she didn't believe it. Okay. Oh goodness, I have an Apple Watch on. And sometimes it does that. I'm talking and I guess maybe Siri's listening in, and she says, this idea of time, the idea of time as a commodity goes against what Apple believes. I don't know, we'll see. But progress and fortune orientation. So we plan for the future, right? We talk about gratification, and then there's this value of continual improvement and progress. So okay, one more, and then I want to reflect before we go on. Other culture-bound values: status and power, measured by economic possessions, credit, titles, positions. You believe your own system of thought, and you sometimes believe that it may be better than other systems of thought, right? Owning goods, space, property. That's a lot, right? Okay, so before I go there, as we let all of those sink in for a second, can you see how if these are your values, and please hear me as saying, if these are your values, okay, they just are. I'm not saying that those are wrong or right, but if those are your values, how, being that these values map onto the dominant cultural system, if others, perhaps your clients even, come in with values that differ from those, how you might think differently about them, right? Status and power. I'm going to backtrack for a second so I can give you some specific examples. Even value of continual improvement and progress. What if your client comes in and they're saying, I feel like where I am is okay. I don't want to get to, Oprah level status. I'm happy with this job that I'm working. It affords me all the resources I need to just pay my bills. And I'm happy with that. I don't need the big house on the lake, or I don't need this or this, right? But perhaps a value system of continuous improvement might in some way communicate to the client, but you should be thinking about the next step. What if to that person there is no next step? Right? Other examples, we talked about individualism and how perhaps you may want to allow the client some space to bring in supporters to think about how their decisions might impact those in their systems, right? Or even how it's okay to be challenged by our clients, and that doesn't make them, oh goodness, what's that word that we try not to say? A person is not defiant. What is it?
Non-compliant.
Non-compliant or defiant, or well, what if that doesn't make them any of those things? It just means that they're advocating for themselves and they have a different perspective than yours. Who's to say that yours is right? So there are all these different ways to think about how if these values that I've just talked about are important to you, how just understanding that these are personal values would be important to explore, continuing to explore your client's values. I think I heard it. Was there a comment?
Sabrina said resistant as one of the words.
Thank you. Yes, that's the word I was trying to get to. It just fell out of my mind. So resistant. No, them advocating for themselves does not make them resistant, right? No. So yeah, your client wanting to stand up for themselves does not impact your right to comfort, right? So there's so much there that really understanding your own value system will help you do. Thoughts about some of the values that I summarized as part of white supremacy culture? Okay. So we're seeing the link then, I believe. I think we're starting to see the link between how acceptance of ownership of some of these values might impact how you see what's normal, how the client sees successes and failures, your sense of about leadership, hierarchy, dominance, and what the professional relationship could look like. Okay.
Sabrina is wondering how to deal with cognitive dissonance.
Talk a little bit more about what you mean by cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, so I'm listening and learning and conceptualizing all of these principles of being aware of white supremacy culture in which we are, in my opinion, thus says Sabrina, we are navigating, and also, and I'm sorry, my dog decided she wanted to make a cameo.
That's okay.
But you know, we are working in a culture that, or a society that is filled with white supremacy culture, and we are trying to help our clients reach places of wellness with respect to their particular cultures and ways of being.
Mm-hmm.
When I say cognitive dissonance, I'm talking about like, how do we acknowledge the white supremacy culture, honor the client's particular culture, and still move them to wellness in a way that doesn't create more issues for them because they're not, for lack of better words, compliant within the white supremacy culture. Am I making sense? Was that clear as mud?
Yes, it was clear as mud. Yes. So yes. And so the word that you first used was acknowledge. And I don't want to underestimate the power of that. How powerful acknowledging just what you've said, those links, the historical factors, the fact that your client would be attempting to navigate these spaces in the bodies that they're in, holding the identities, the unique combination of identities that they hold, and yet, right? There's always the and yet. And how powerful it would be for their counselor, whoever that person identifies as, to give them space to talk about it in counseling, right? And to help them really begin to explore by asking the questions that perhaps maybe their friends and family haven't asked, or giving them a space to explain, make those links, talk out loud about it, how powerful that really is. So that's the first step, I would say, is talking about it with them. And then perhaps the client, you can both begin to create a future, a way to handle that's unique to them. I don't know that there's a one size fits all approach, but I do think that it starts with the space to talk about it. And this is what broaching will help us do, is bring it up, right? Acknowledge that it's even operating in the space that we're in, or you will be in with your client in the counseling room, but also it's part of their lived experience. I know it sounds really simple, but there are a lot of people who aren't doing that, right? Who aren't making those links. And then the client's walking away feeling like, well, yeah, I mean, I talked about how I'm uncomfortable in my work environment, but I didn't really get into it. And so I still feel unheard, because there's so many things that we didn't actually explore, right? We talk about it on a surface level, but making those links is what's important. And perhaps when we walk through some of the ideas, when we walk through the multi-dimensional model of broaching behavior, hopefully we can get even more clear as mud. I like that phrase, with how you can broach on different levels. So I think it's coming. It's coming. Okay. Thank you so much for that question. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts before we move on?
I was just thinking about how this all of these factors aren't even serving me well as a white person. They're not even serving me well. So who could they be serving?
Oh, can you share an example about what you mean?
Can you go back a slide? I'm trying to remember what the phrasing was. Like the quantity over quality, the there was one before that as well, like where we're focused on like production and perfectionism. That was the first one that struck me. And the sense of urgency. These things that I've even brought up in counseling sessions where I'm struggling with identity and things because I'm looking at the product of my labor instead of the process. And so if those aren't serving me, who are they serving?
That really impacts me. Yeah. So if these things aren't serving me, who the heck are they in? Who the heck are they serving? And why are we still doing this, right? But it's such a part of our culture at this point that if you don't do it, then perhaps you're seen as difficult, defiant. I lost the word again. What was the word that fell out of my mind? Resistant. Yes, resistant. Perhaps that is evidence of how I really try not to use it because it falls out of my mind all the time. Resistant. But, oh goodness, I'm not going to go there. I was just thinking there was a more recent example of something that just happened in the news that I think really ties all this in, but I don't want to make it about I am not going to go there today. Okay. We are going to stick to the topic at hand. But yes, all of these, this sits with us in lots of different ways. I hear that you're really beginning to wrestle with some of these challenges and thinking about how you can be more aware of these values as they are operating within your own mind in your clinical work. Okay. Oh, this is great. This is great. So I'll click ahead here. So we did this. Yes. Okay. As you're becoming more aware, let's give some examples, if any have come up for you at this point. How have these values shown up in your clinical work? Can anyone think of an example?
Go ahead. If I understand the question correctly, I work a lot with children and teens, and I had a young man who was in 3rd grade who was always getting into trouble, getting into fights, and his guardian was like, I think they've labeled him as a troublemaker, as a bad kid. And background was there was grief. He was being fostered by family members. I mean, there's just lots of layers and layers and layers. And when I walked into the IEP meeting, everybody else was white like me. And I'm like, nah, we gotta advocate for this, because sitting with him working in session, his reading was off the scale. His mathematic calculations in his head was off the scale. He was bored sitting in the regular class. And no one thought to investigate that. No one thought to look at beyond the behavior. And the guardian said to me, well, can you say more? Because, you're white, you're the counselor, you have more power. And I said, no, this is the letter that you write to the principal to request this. This is what we do. This is to kind of give him more power to try to advocate for that. So advocacy is a big part of recognizing that, okay, just because maybe other students get this easier doesn't mean you're not entitled to it. Doesn't mean that if we get you special education services, doesn't mean you're dumb, doesn't mean you're going to be labeled and the rest of your, it's just so layered with that. And sometimes I will self-disclose myself that, hey, I was a Head Start kid. So tell me what it's like for you with your family, with a child who was in Head Start, and how do we go from there? And that sometimes helps break down that unofficial barrier, because they assume that I'm white, that I don't understand, that I don't get it.
Wow.
Did I answer the question, or did I go too sideways?
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm hearing is you've had some practice trying digging a little bit deeper, right? Acknowledging what's happening under the surface and advocating for clients, ensuring that they get access to the services that they actually need. Mm-hmm.
And it took a long time. I mean, I've been I graduated in 2011, so been doing this a while, but it took a long time to be comfortable for me to say, well, I'm the white chick. Your family looks different. How is this? How can I help? What does this mean to you? And I'm getting more comfortable with bringing that in the room, and the clients are like, oh, you actually said it. I'm like, it's here, whether we talk about it or not. So how can I help you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how did you get comfortable doing that?
Practice and some courage, and and I think the more that I was courageous enough to be frank about it and bring it up to the client, then the client was able to be more vulnerable and talk about what it was like and what was this. But yeah, I wish I had a magic way of how I did, but and some of it was in my program, because it was Loyola Pastoral Counseling Program, and we really did a multi-pronged approach to be vulnerable and to check our biases and to look cross-culturally at a lot of stuff that was just embedded in our program. So I was very lucky with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing. I hear just courage. That's a great place to start. Just doing it, right? And being practicing cultural humility, right? Just learning that, yeah, this is my bias, this is my experience, and having the courage to share that with other people. That goes a long way to helping build rapport and just getting things out there. Thank you. What about for others? How have you noticed some of these values show up in your clinical work?
Sabrina shared in the chat, give me 1 minute. She said, I think I find a lot of my work with clients helping them learn how to celebrate their progress toward goals and challenge the pressure of perfectionism. One of my Sabrina-isms is give yourself grace.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So you're noticing how much perfectionism tends to show up, and just acknowledging, well, that is a value, but it doesn't necessarily have to be your value as the client, right? Just beginning to separate that and showing clients sometimes that you don't have to buy into that, and that's okay, can be really helpful. Yeah, give yourself some grace. It's okay that you didn't do this. And what does that mean for you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Love it. Thank you so much for sharing. Anything else pop up before we continue on? Okay. All right. Let's keep going. Thank you all for sharing. So the next question that you're probably wondering is, okay, so we've spent a lot of time walking through values and biases and perhaps some challenges that you may have experienced, but how do we do this thing that we've been talking about, right? How do you provide culturally competent counseling? I do think the truth is that there's probably no completely correct, let me take it back, not completely correct. There's no one size fits all. That's what I mean. Approach. However, there are some suggestions, and one of the foundational skills that we're going to focus on for the purposes of this presentation is broaching. So the next slide, perfect, I lit into that really well. A foundational skill, broaching. What is this thing? You've probably heard about it. You may have read something about it in the past, but we're going to walk through the who, what, where, why, when, maybe even how of it, and practice today. So that makes me excited. Okay, who broaches? Counselors and supervisors. That's who should broach, okay? And it's really our responsibility as the trained professional in the room to engage in this process. It is not the client's responsibility to just lay out all of the stuff, all of their cultural stuff, their experiences, even when we're doing, even when we're doing intakes with our clients, right? whose responsibility is it to get the story, to learn about the client's experience? It's ours. Often, it's funny, it's often when I talk to my students about how to do an intake, I say, well, did you ask that question? Oh, they would say, well, I didn't get that information, or they didn't tell me. My next question is, well, did you ask? Well, no, I didn't ask. Well, then what do you expect? Right? They're coming to you. You're the professional. So you need to be asking about their experience of their identities, how it impacts them, how all these things relate together. And we'll talk about how you can do that. But it is up to you. Do not rely on the client to make all those connections for you and to do it in a well laid out, organized way for you. That's not on them. That's on us. Now, the what. Broaching is a set of clinical behaviors designed to help the client more fully explore their presenting concern and help them explore issues of race, ethnicity, and culture. Where? I like this. Where? Any discussion where the client is present. All the time, right? It's not like there are certain topics that we want to broach. It should be something that the client feels that you make an intentional effort, no matter what they're talking about, to make these connections, to weave everything together. It shouldn't be when the client says, oh, I'm coming in because I'm bringing a topic that relates to race. Oh, that triggers broaching for you. No, if that's only when you're broaching, you are missing huge, huge parts of clients' experiences and stories, right? So I like to say the when, broach early and often. This starts at the first meeting, right? First session, when you're exploring what brings them in, who they are, how did they identify. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something that's on you to be doing all the time, just weaving those connections together. And it really does. It contributes to enhanced conceptualizations, and it strengthens your working relationship and your rapport. It helps the client feel heard. And my goodness, it also increases the likelihood that the client is going to come back. Imagine being the person who was like just waiting, right? Oh, I've got this story, I've got all these details, but my counselor never asked. They never cared enough to dig, to help me make those connections, but all those things were just lurking under the surface. Is that person going to come back? Likely not. They're going to get the sense that you don't understand enough to know what rocks to lift, right? To look under. That's our job. Okay. And the how? Stay tuned. Aha, okay. I like that. Who, what, where, when, how. Okay. This phrase, I like this. I've been seeing lots of like internet memes about how it started versus how it's going. So this is me attempting to stay hip, right? So how it started versus how it's going, the broaching edition. Broaching was developed by Norman Devines and colleagues in 2007, I believe was one of the earliest publications. And in that publication, just outlined the concept, what it is, why it's important, and then moved on to some surveys. So surveyed counselor attitudes about broaching behaviors in 2013. Devines and colleagues continued their work by developing the multidimensional model of broaching behaviors, which integrated the multicultural social justice counseling competencies that was published in 2020. And I'm actually going to share with you that model. And I believe most recently, there was a publication that outlined strategies of broaching race, ethnicity, and culture, which was published earlier this summer. So this has been something that's been in a developing area of research, and I'm really excited for. I love this research. I think that it's important to what we do, and just very nicely breaks down steps for us about how to begin to open up these discussions. And I love charts. She does charts. It's very helpful to me and in my teaching. So I'll share with you one of those charts. How it started versus how it's going. Okay, so to broach or not to broach. If you read my first bullet there, trick question, yes, broach, right? Broach early and often. And really, what is it? This is the definition that comes from the article. Counselors' deliberate and intentional efforts to discuss racial, ethnic, and cultural concerns, and you'll see it abbreviated as REC concerns that may impact a client's presenting concerns. So does REC only refer to race? No, it does not, right? That word culture, that's a broad term that encompasses a lots of identities and experiences. So REC is just, how do I want to make sense of how all of these identities and experiences interconnect, right? For that person and their unique combination of identities. Why do we broach? We broach because it invites the client to make connections between REC concerns and the presenting problem, right? It grants the client permission to talk about a taboo topic. Taboo, I think, is in quotes because sometimes we get clients who come in and they're like, is this okay for me to talk about here? Can I do that? Can I talk? Is it safe enough for me to say this? Yeah, it is, right? I tell my clients all the time, this is your time, this is your space. Please don't worry about having to temper what you're going to say based on how you might perceive my understanding of your experience. That is not for you to do, right? If you have to do that, then you are limiting your amount of processing based on how you're viewing me, right? You don't have to babysit me. You don't have to caretake me, right? Not your job. So I just want you to put it out there. And if I have questions, I'll ask. If I have things that I want to know more about, I'm going to ask that too. And I also suggest that you say that early. Just go ahead and put that out there before you get the question, is it safe? Is this a taboo topic? Can I use this word here? Just, I'll often say something like, yeah, there's really no word that's off limits, no topic that's off limits. Now, there may be certain things that I may have questions about, or I may have some feedback about if you say things that I'm like, oh, that could be damaging, or what do you mean by that? Hey, that's part of the work too. But I don't want you to feel like you can't bring it in because this is your time. Right? And I often see sort of a shoulders kind of drop thing when I say that to my clients, because they're like, okay, she's at least making an effort to show me that this is a safe space, right? To communicate. That's not really showing yet, but it's communicating that this is my intention for this space. Okay, and it moves the client toward a more effective problem solving, problem resolution. So we can begin to make these connections. We've really lifted up all the racks. And then I get, hopefully, what will be a more full conceptualization of the client for me to use information to guide how I'm treating them, what approach I'm selecting, where we're going with all of this. What if I don't know? I'm kind of in the dark, and I'm not even giving myself a chance to do my best work because I don't have all the data. Okay. The continuum of broaching behaviors. This is an important one. I want you to do some self-reflection here because I'll walk through all of these categories. And as I walk through this, I want you to check in with yourself. Is this me as a counselor, right? So this continuum starts with avoidant and goes to infusing, and it encompasses some behaviors for which you may associate with how you broach. Are you the avoidant counselor who ignores the significance of REC issues by deflecting attention from clients' racialized concerns and redirecting the attention to more general topics? Client comes in and they're talking about their experience of a low rating on a performance review from a white supervisor. And you say, well, that same supervisor gave everyone else the same review or similar review using the same criteria. So it's not about race. It can't be. Well, maybe it isn't, but did you give him a chance to really explore and make connections there? Right? We can't automatically dismiss a client's experience because you don't get the sense that it relates to race, ethnicity, or culture, or you have no details about that yet. So it's a tendency to, instead of helping the client continue to explore, we automatically go toward, or I should say, not say we, the avoidant counselor automatically goes toward more general topics. Nope, not that. Right? Maybe it could be both. It could be both intentional, like, this feels unsafe, I don't know how to talk about that, and instead of going there, we're going to go pop up here to something that feels more comfortable. Or it could be completely unintentional and you have no idea that you're doing it. Okay? So just check in. You don't have to identify yourself, but just check in. Is this me? Have I done that? Are you the isolating counselor? The counselor who minimally broaches, sort of in an obligatory fashion. Like, okay, I'm going to ask, like, what's that like for you? All right. And that's the extent of where you go. But did that make connections at all? Did it help to really explore your conceptualization of that client? Maybe, maybe not. It's the isolating. So I'm going to go there in little bits, okay? Or are you the continuing / incongruent counselor, where you might broach, but in a mechanical way, often lacking verbal dexterity? So an ability to use the client's language to help dig and deepen and make those connections, to really talk explicitly about the client's REC concerns. You might be the continuing and congruent counselor. So you're trying, but you recognize that it's kind of awkward and it feels robotic, but you're doing it. Okay, you're doing it. Are you the integrated / congruent counselor? The counselor who helps clients make connections between their presenting concerns and REC concerns as appropriate. So you are doing it, and you're doing it when it comes up, you're doing it when it feels necessary. Or are you the infusing counselor, where you might broach REC concerns with clients by maintaining a social justice focus that addresses barriers that impede the client's progress and well-being by exhibiting multicultural and social justice counseling interventions, right? So it's like broaching, but also acknowledging all of the other stuff that's in the room. And we'll talk about that stuff when we look at that chart, the continuum behavior or continuum of broaching behaviors. Okay, so just checking in. You don't have to identify with which version of the counselor you believe that you might be, but do you see yourself on this chart? Or how you might believe you broach? And if you do, are you comfortable with that? Do you want to learn to broach or move yourself along to be more of an infusing broacher? Okay. Again, that's more of a self-check-in. Okay. Now, the absence of, so if you're the avoidant counselor, and I realize that's a little small, if you're the avoidant counselor, or if you don't broach at all, you are inconsistent in your broaching, right? Clients report that a perceived insensitivity to personal or cultural meanings of experiences, meaning that clients of inconsistent broaching counselors believe that there must be some cultural conflict. They experience cultural concealment, meaning they don't feel like they can truly explore all of the pieces of the things that make them them. And so they might hide bits and pieces of it from you as their counselor, right? Or they even may experience some mistrust towards you, which could lead to underutilization of counseling services and premature termination. My words this morning, it's early. Termination. Yeah. So all this is making sense, right? If you don't broach, right, your client will feel like you don't get it, like you don't have the skills to really understand them, and they're just not going to go there, or they're going to hide pieces of themselves from you. That's it. Right? Ick. We don't want that. Now, missed opportunities though. So maybe it's not even that you're like intentionally not trying to broach, but there could be some missed opportunities. Like, you're in the thick of a discussion or conversation, and there's like something, a phrase or a word or something pops up and you're like, I kind of want to go there. That's interesting. What do I want to do with that? And you're just not sure, right? Even if we miss opportunities, sometimes our clients may feel, again, unheard, really, right? And it may help them continue to reinforce some stereotypes about counseling. It may decrease your counselor credibility and all icky things, right? I pulled this example, and I have a picture of it actually from an article that I'm quoting here, and I want to read it to you as an example. So, during a counseling session with his white European American counselor, Tyrone, an African American male adolescent, reveals his reluctance to shop in retail stores because he believes that he is constantly under surveillance by sales personnel due to their perceptions that he is a thief and not a paying customer. So if you are an avoidant counselor, you can see how this example might be really easy to be like, oh, we're just not going to go there. Or I'm going to dismiss Tyrone's experience, and we're not going to explore REC concerns related to this. We could say, hey, this is the experience of all young people shopping in stores. Right? They all get followed. They're all assumed to be stealing. In reality, that may not be true, and that may not be Tyrone's experience. But by the counselor ignoring that and offering a more generalized explanation, what does that tell Tyrone? You don't hear me. Not only do you not hear me, you're not even making an effort to be in the ballpark to hear me, right? So by just that one missed opportunity could completely change the trajectory of your counseling work, right? And signal, this is not going to work. Yeah. So even if, and I don't mean to be doomsday here, because you may miss an opportunity. Maybe you're in your head, you're thinking about what to say, not quite sure how to get at it. That happens all the time. There's always opportunities to go back and check in and recognize, hey, I missed that. And I recognize that could be really important. Can we back up a second? You have to own your thoughts and kind of, I like to use my internal working dialogue as an example for the client. Like just what I just said, like, hey, I was kind of in my head and I was thinking about how that could be important. I didn't quite have the right language at the time to help you to pause us and help us go a little bit deeper there. But I'm with you now, and I would like to back up if it's still important, right? Use those self-involving statements, because that shows, right, you're making an effort and you're at least aware of some of the rocks, right, to turn over. And it shows that you're not perfect, but you're in the process with them. Any thoughts about this as we continue? Okay.
Humility does a lot.
Absolutely. That's cultural humility. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I did want to share, Sabrina mentioned earlier, let me scroll up to it 1 second, that she finds it's pretty fluid for her depending on the subject and what's happening in her personal life as well.
And what is fluid? Is it the cultural humility?
The continuum.
Oh, okay. So it depends. Yeah. Ooh, that's a good point. So sometimes perhaps maybe there may be a topic that you may be more comfortable broaching versus other topics. And that could be depending on what's going on in your life, how you personally identify. Maybe religion is something that you're more comfortable broaching with clients versus gender identity, right? It depends. Now, that's an important bit of personal awareness, though, right? So recognize, what are those things that you are more comfortable talking about, less comfortable talking about, and why? What makes those things, what makes it so? And thinking about how you can seek some professional development or opportunities to talk more in spaces that feel comfortable for now while you get that practice. Right? What reading can you do? What other professional development opportunities can you do like this, or go to conferences? There's so many ways to continue to to learn and grow, right? This is a lifelong journey. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It looks like Sabrina raised her hand.
Okay.
I don't want to do too much talking, but I just kind of wanted to, you know, I always tell on myself. So in acknowledging kind of the fluidity of where I am on the spectrum depends on what the topic is and what's happening. I'll use this quick example. I do understand we should always broach, and we should do so strategically and respectfully. But I'll very quickly use the example of, you know, with our political climate as an example,
Yes.
because of my own experiences of things, sometimes, and quite honestly, my own exhaustion, my cultural exhaustion with some things. If things come up in a session, sometimes I am a little hesitant to help the client explore more deeply, because I'm like, man, I'm tired. And which then I always turn around and go to my own therapist and work through my stuff. But I just wanted to acknowledge the ebb and flow of that, while I am aspiring to broach more, if that makes sense.
Yes, it sure does. That does make sense. I do also think it's important what you said about how when you're noticing that happen, like perhaps you're less, you might not want to go there because of just personal exhaustion with what's going on. You also make sure to find a space where you can talk about it in a way that's appropriate for you, right? The only thing I think what's important about that clinically is, yes, either supervision, personal counseling, but what does that mean for the client who perhaps there was a missed opportunity, right? And we all have done this at times, right? Or we're tired. We have other triggering experiences around perhaps topics that our clients are bringing in, and it's like, oh, I can't go there today. But then the client doesn't get the space to talk about it. Right? So that's I think an important thing to be aware of as well. And yes, I love how you said, and I have another space where I can go and really work through that. That's great awareness. Yeah. I mean, we're all human. We're going to have those experiences. Yeah. And it's what do you do with that? Making sure that our clients are getting the best care. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sabrina. Oh, this is great. Okay. So we're all increasing awareness, thinking about what's important here, how we might do this. Where are some of the sticking points? Okay. Continuing with sticking points. Whispers of self-doubt. As we're talking about broaching early, often, how, blah, blah. Okay, we got it, right? But you're probably also thinking in the back of your mind, what if I'm wrong? What if I come off as insensitive or offensive or ignorant? Or what if I just don't know what to say? Have you had some of those thoughts before? Probably. Are there any other examples of whispers of self-doubt? Maybe things that you've thought around broaching or culturally competent counseling in the past?
I have heard a lot, like, as a white person, it's my job to educate myself and not the person with a different identity, their job to educate me. But then when it is an incident where it's like I could look ignorant, I have that question of, do I broach it knowing that I may or may not have the competence and like the background and the research behind it, and risk putting the other person in a situation where they have to educate me, or do I let it go, do my own research, and come back to it?
What if it's kind of both? What if it's risking broaching, realizing in the moment as the client is saying, no, that's not right, or there's more to the story here that you do need to know more. And I what I'm hearing there is it could be a hesitance around being wrong, right? Quote unquote wrong, or seen as like, oh, insensitive, like you don't know what you're talking about, or like you need to go and do some more research. But I think that we all will need to go and do some more research about something at some point, right? Because of the continuing growing nature around culture, how things change and how quickly, that's always going to be the case, right? There is never, at no point are any of us going to be able to say, we've got it, check everything off. And that's okay, right? I think that's, to acknowledge that is to really give yourself some grace, to use that phrase again. Like, it's okay to not know. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to say, you know what? I'm realizing in the moment, I do need to do some more reading. And I really appreciate you sharing with me your personal experience. Between now and the next session, I'm going to go read about that. And so, yeah, you're highlighting to the client, this is the work that you're going to do. And you're showing them that you're energized around this. You want to make an effort to know and to really at least get the foundational knowledge, so you can have, so you can build on that as they talk to you about their personal experience. So I think there's a difference in asking the client to share their personal experience versus asking them to teach you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because you're right, like that isn't their responsibility. But sometimes they will share, oh, well, this is Ramadan, or this is, in their story, those things might come out. But then if you find yourself wanting to know more of the details, like the background about specific topics, that's your cue to say, oh, write this down. I need to go back and read about this and explore on my own. Mm-hmm. Any other whispers that come up? Okay. So have y'all had any of these thoughts that are on the slide? What if I'm wrong? What if I come off as insensitive? I don't want to offend anyone. Perhaps. Yeah. Okay. So as these come up though, what do you do? How do we overcome some of these barriers? And these are really common challenges that counselors report. How might you overcome those? Earlier, it was said, you just got to be courageous. Try it, get out there and do it and see what happens. That could be one way. Right? You rely on your relationship. Do your own learning. All of those things are true. And we have some specific guidance provided by the literature, right? So in stage 1, Devines et al., she suggests, and I should say they suggest starting with joining. We all know what that means, right? That's small talk, expressing interest in the client, communicating a shared understanding of the client's world, right? The perceptual world. And you can use your foundational counseling skills to do that. We do that already when we first meet our new client, right? All right, how you doing? We open with small talk. How's the weather? How's your family? All those things, right? What are you doing this weekend? Just learning about them, right? In that, it's important to use the client's language and get a sense of what that is. How are they referring to certain things? And then use that language. We all know how important that is. Step 2 would be validating the client's feelings and beginning to convey a sense of acceptance, right, with what their emotional experience is. You can do that non-verbally and verbally. Step 3, affirm the meanings that the client attaches to their experiences. This one you can really get at with some of those how and what questions. What do you mean by that? How? Tell me about. Really just learning what they're saying. Affirm the meanings. This is important because salience looks different to different people, right? And so perhaps my meaning of a term or an experience may be completely different than another person's. Okay? And so if a client is saying, this is what I do when I, oh goodness, the examples are falling out of my mind. When I speak in tongues, like if you've heard that before, what does speaking in tongues mean to you, right? What does that, you don't have, when I say what does that look like, I don't mean actually demonstrate, but Tell me a little bit about it, right? Like, right. So affirm the meaning. You may have in your mind an idea of what speaking in tongues is, but doesn't mean the same thing for them. So it's always just that curiosity that helps you begin to attach like a real understanding to that person's experience. And then lastly, verbalization of the client's strengths and resources. So find areas of strength and highlight those for them, both individual and community based, right? So these are things that you're already doing undoubtedly, right? You're beginning to join with your client. That is the first place to start. Always important to building that relationship. And then in step 2, this is assessment. And that's a cognitive process that precedes a broaching event and involves thoughtful analysis of whether the counselor's broaching behavior is warranted based on 6 considerations. What are those considerations? Bum, 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 they're right there for you. So these considerations, they're labeled considerations because they may or may not be applicable to that particular client, but you may just want to internally check in. So what is your multicultural case conceptualization? Right? Do you have one? Like, have you thought through kind of how their racial identity functioning, what that looks like, how it relates to their identities, constellation? What are their identities? Like, do you know all of that? If not, you may want to continue to explore. Right? This is a good opportunity for you to begin to broach and ask those questions. What is the client's readiness to explore RAC concerns? Sometimes you may get a sense that the client, remember I said, like, we can talk about an issue up here, like to the cows come home, and it feel like, okay, we did something, but we didn't really dig down deep. Is that where the client is right now? Is staying up here what's comfortable for now? Maybe, right? And how do you get a sense of that? Right? Are they ready to actually go below the surface level stuff and start making those connections? Maybe they are. Okay. Do you know that? How would you know that? How do you get that information from your specific client? You ask, I suppose, right? Or you that's the best way. So as you begin to check in about all these things, even counselor self-efficacy, how do you feel about this? Are you ready? Do you have the skills? Have you checked in with yourself about all of those things? As you learn about those things, as you walk through these considerations, then you can get a sense of, okay, I think I'm ready. I think it may be a good time to jump in and begin to follow up on some of these wonderings that I have, right? So I inserted this next slide because I think it's important when we talk about cultural conceptualization to think about, like, what? How do I do that? What does that mean? First, you want to explore cultural identity. Like, what does that look like? And there are a number of models out there, but here are 2 really good ones that I like to use a lot. So the addressing model and the respectful model. And you may have seen these in the past, but as a reminder, these go through different identity dimensions and helps you just check in to make sure that you have an understanding of how this person identifies and what is their experience around these issues. Right? What is their unique identity constellation? When I say constellation, that's really intersectionality. So how do they identify on all of these things? And what does that mean as far as social location? Are they, and there's another model, which I should have pulled for you, but there's another model that has things sort of like in a big circle, and then a line, a horizontal line of dominance. And so identities that are above the horizontal line of dominance, that's like privileged identities, and there are identities that are below the horizontal line of dominance, and those are oppressed identities, or ones that there is marginalization attached to. So even if we were to look at, I'm just choosing the R because I looked up first and I see religious and spiritual identity under the respectful model. In the US, where there might be the most privilege around religious and spiritual identity would be Christianity. So that would be the one that's the identity that's above the line of dominance. And then anything else would be the below the line of dominance, right? Where there's some marginalization. So you may have a client who identifies as Christian above the line of dominance, but also as a gay male. So below the line of dominance on that other identity marker, right? So as you look at that person's constellation, look at the combination of identities that have some privilege, that don't, or that are more marginalized, and how does that look for that person as they move throughout day-to-day life? That's an important discussion to have, right? So you may look at someone and say, well, they identify as part of as part of the majority, but they also may have all of these other marginalized identities that also impact their daily life and how they move throughout the world. So really bringing an understanding to that and demonstrating your understanding of that to your client will be important. Any thoughts or questions about exploration of cultural identity? Okay. This helps contribute to your cultural conceptualization of your client and helps understand them just a little bit more. And you can demonstrate, yeah, like I know a little bit about this stuff. Even if I don't know everything, I know where to look. Right? I have some ideas about what to ask you about. And it helps you to remember, oh, wait, I kind of understand, or I shouldn't use the word understand, but I kind of have heard from the client a little bit about their experience of sexual identity or spirituality, but what we haven't talked about is nation of origin or gender or developmental disability. So if you don't know those things, also ask, because we might not know. And remember, it's our responsibility to gather that data. Okay. Or even trauma, right? All things that are really important. Going back to the steps. So stage 3, this is preparation. That's including all the steps we just talked about. 1, 2, that would be joining, and then assessment. It includes all of those steps, and then kind of builds on that, where we think about actually jumping into this broaching event that we're gonna try. We're gonna do this, right? So set your intention. Why are you going to ask this question? Or broaching doesn't have to be a question, but why are you going to go there? Why are you going to make this statement? What's your intention of doing so? Is it to learn more about their experience within this one unique identity dimension? Is it to tie together their experience with you as someone who identifies differently than them, and then relate that to their experience at work with other people who identify similarly to you? Like, really understanding why you're about to do this is important, right? Just throwing out statements all willy-nilly, it may help you gather data and explore a little bit, but something more targeted would also be helpful. And I think that's what the MBB will help you do. The multi-dimensional model of broaching behavior will really help you target the why, right? What is the purpose of this broaching statement or question that you're about to make? Okay. And then begin to label the forms of oppression that come out of what you're learning. Labeling in this way sometimes is really important to our clients. It helps to engage in structural competence and normalizes their experience. So what do I mean by normalizing? It doesn't say, oh, okay, well, sexism, that's every woman's experience, so you should get over it. That's not at all what I mean. Please don't hear me say that. That's not it. It is giving the space to the client to say, oh, wow, this is systemic, right? And what does that mean now? So tying those things together is really helpful and gives the client permission to talk about it. And so it takes it a little bit out of the realm of it's just you to, wow, like there are some real like meaty systemic things that we can jump into here. Okay. Oh, I went backwards. There we go. Stage 4, delivery. And that's doing it, right? So final stage, you're going to make this broaching statement. You're going to communicate it, ask the question, or if it's a statement, just communicate the statement. Allow for some silence. Just put it out there. This is okay. I want to make sure to say this. Sometimes we're already in our mind working up to like, okay, if I say this, what's this going to be like? And oh my gosh, if they don't respond immediately, that means I've made a grave mistake. I made an error. I have ruptured the relationship. The rapport is damaged forever. Oh my gosh, swoon, right? Like, it doesn't have to be that way. You have to trust the process a little bit to give space for the client to think about it without allowing your own feelings about perhaps your discomfort to encroach. So putting it out there, letting it sit, and that being okay, using silence. And then also being okay with the client saying, I don't know, or that doesn't work, or whatever, right? So you can use some reflective statements, perhaps even restating what you mean, because sometimes perhaps the way you've communicated it isn't as clear as it could be. That's okay, right? So you can use the client's response to discuss relevant socio-political issues and name the structural elements that are relating to the forms of oppression that you're pointing out, that you're highlighting within the client's experience. And then you can continue to gather more data. This sounds simple, right? Maybe. But it actually can be a lot. And in our next slides, we're going to walk through the multidimensional model and then close with a case study. So I think we're doing okay on time. I want to make sure we get to the case because I'm so excited to share this with y'all. Okay, so I'm going to move us forward. Multidimensional model of broaching behaviors. And this has 4 different, they're not steps, but they're more categories of broaching statements, behaviors that you can make, right? And it starts with intra-counseling. Intra-counseling is more like intra-dyad. So that's between yourself and the client, the people in the room. That's the counselor's acknowledgments of similarities and differences and an exploration of interpersonal processes that govern the counseling relationship. Cultural differences and misunderstandings between the counselor and client have the potential to create an unhealthy power dynamic within the counseling dyad. So we know that, right? Which may contribute to countertransference. So really that is bringing up all the things that may be present within your relationship between yourself and the client. That may mean statements like just acknowledging that there's a difference between how you identify and the client identifies. That may mean pointing out any sense of holding back or mistrust that you get a sense of in the relationship. Just bring all those things to the surface. This sounds really easy, but that's kind of hard, right? Just pointing out those differences, because sometimes it seems easier to fly under the radar. Like, I don't need to share those things. Or is it important for me to go there? Sometimes it is. So you want to convey that discussions of RAC concerns are permissible. This is okay. The only way to do that is to lead by example. Hey, I identify as a Black woman. I recognize that you may not. Right? Like, okay, it's out there. Nothing's wrong or right about that. It is what it is. And I just want to, make intentional space for these discussions at this point, and of course throughout our work together, because I bring a specific lens based on my experiences and my background to this work that you may not share. And so I recognize that some things that I might say, or suggestions that I might offer, or even questions that I might ask may be very driven by that unique lens. And I just want to make sure that that's in the room and we can talk about it. Just a statement like that, right? Yeah. So it's communicating, this is okay, we're going to be doing this. We as individuals will be part of this process, and we're not going to pretend that we are devoid of cultural experiences, because we're not. Okay, so we got that. That's the intent of intra-counseling broaching, right? Okay, that's first category. Moving on. Second is intra-individual. That's the counselor's acknowledgement of the confluence of identity dimensions that operate, such as race, gender, class, socioeconomic status, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, immigrant status, and occupation. So a lot of things, right? So it's just saying, hey, it's giving permission to the client to explore all of the different identities that they hold and how their different locations. Remember, I was talking about the horizontal line of dominance and how you may have within one person all little dots over that map, above and below that horizontal line of dominance. That's pointing out this is the case. It permits the client to explore the relationship, the overlap, the confluence of all those identity dimensions, and it addresses intersectionality. It avoids essentializing or reducing the client to just their race or just one identity dimension or factor, right? And gives them permission to say, hey, like, I have this view, perhaps driven by these experiences because of being a woman, but I also have these experiences because of being gay. Like, whatever it is, okay, now we can bat both of those around, and they're both in the room for us to work on. Okay, so we're building, right? First, in the relationship, intra-counseling. Now it's intra-individual inside the client. Okay, so we got another one we're going to build on. Intra-REC. Remember, REC is race, ethnicity, and culture. So this is the counselor's acknowledgement of within group concerns that may arise between the supervisee and people, oh, sorry, I should have said and counselor, whom they share common heritage, right? So these are the counselor's personal beliefs, value orientations, and behaviors that are at odds with the values and viewpoints sanctioned by other cultural groups. All right, so this is acknowledging, so we're building, right? Individual, okay, now because of these different identities, you may have within group differences and ideas, value systems, beliefs, and biases that differ from other people, perhaps even in your family, who identify as similarly. And what does that mean for you? Right? Well, my parents think this, and I think this, right? There's a generational difference, or I have the salience of my spirituality is different for me personally than it is for my parents. And what does that mean, right? We're highlighting all of these differences. And it gets away from just saying, well, I have chosen to not go to church every Sunday. But if you really dig in and broach at all those different levels, now you're getting all of that detail that you get to contribute to your conceptualization. It helps the client explore more. Okay, so we're building, right? This is good. This makes me excited. We're going to keep going. I'm going to move us ahead a little bit quickly or quicker. And lastly, intra-REC. So this is the counselor's acknowledgement of the client's encounters with racism, discrimination, as well as other forms of oppression that create distress for the client. And so within group difference, their experiences, and now building on top of that, the client's experience just in the world because of social cultural factors and their identities. This one's a big one. Right? This acknowledges the role of racism, discrimination, power, and oppression in the client's life. Identify strategies for combating oppressive forces through psychological resistance mechanisms and implement social justice and advocacy interventions. So now that we're acknowledging, okay, wow, sexism, racism, oppression, all of those things, what do we do about that? Okay? How can you as an individual move throughout your individual experiences in a way that's facilitative, while recognizing we may not be able to change the system, but how can you operate within it? And even just having that conversation can be hard, but also really important to have. You acknowledge sometimes like there could be a sense of powerlessness from even just what I just said. My goodness, I just had an exhale moment, like a with that. I did a lot of that last summer when there was, oh goodness, we had a lot of protests and events that were going on in our world where we had clients saying, this sucks, and yet I feel so powerless to change it. Well, what am I gonna do here? Right? And I have to get up and I have to go to work with people who believe this, right? Who see me as this. And what do? if we didn't broach, or if we did not make space for that conversation, imagine the emotions that you might have missed, right? That sense of powerlessness, all of which are important to talk about in this work. Okay. Questions about the multidimensional model before we move forward? 4 areas. We're going to build on it. And hopefully you'll get some practice with our case study. Yeah.
I have a question about towards the beginning, talking about the counselor disclosing their own identities. How far would you go with that? Like, would you start and just go down the list and be like, okay, well, this is my gender, race, country of origin, religion, sexual orientation, like all the way down, or just the things that are initially relevant and continuing disclosing as they become relevant?
So my answer is going to be clear as mud on this one, okay? All right. So first, I would say this is definitely an it depends. And the question that I would always ask is, what would be your intention behind sharing all the things, and would all the things be necessary? So if you decide, well, yeah, it's all necessary and it feels all important, you could try it, see what happens. But I don't know that it's always all necessary to say. You can make a decision around maybe things that you feel comfortable with sharing up front, and then as the work progresses, you can decide if you want to disclose other identities, right? And you can also get a sense of what the client is bringing in, or if you're recognizing that perhaps your biases, beliefs, experiences are being pulled on, right, or triggered because of whatever a client's presenting concern, or wherever your discussion has gone, and you're recognizing, oh wait, I am thinking this way because of this identity or my experience here in this particular social location. That's definitely a cue that you can bring it up. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it seems like a continual process where you're negotiating, okay, do I share this? Is it appropriate to bring up at this time? But interestingly, and I know this is like not quite the same, but immediately in my mind, I go to when I worked with adolescents in a school as a school counselor, and I spent some time, and I recognized very quickly that it was very helpful for me to boil down maybe like 3 things about myself that I felt comfortable sharing. And I just chose those same 3 things to share with each student that I met with. And I did that like the first time I met with them. I'm like, hi, as I was introducing myself, this is who I am, ... right? Just went down those 3 things and put it out there. And that helped the joining process. But I don't know if I'd go through like all 18 things, up front. Yeah, so hopefully I answered your question clear as mud. Okay. Does anyone else have thoughts about that? How would you disclose who you are or how you identify? You're thinking about it. Okay. Thank you. Oh, we made it to our case study. I'm very excited about this. Okay, so it's actually about a page long. So I didn't want to include it here on the slide, but I did include a QR code for you to bring up on your own computer so that you could scroll, revisit parts at your leisure. If you haven't used a QR code before, you use a device with a camera like a smartphone or an iPad or some kind of tablet. And you open the camera, center your camera to the code on the screen, and it should pull up a little bar, something should pop up on your screen that's going to ask you, do you want to open the link that it's going to bring you to? You just hit yes, and it will bring you to a page where it talks about a case there. Does everybody have it up? Awesome. I'm going to give us, let's say, at least 5 minutes, because it's kind of long, to read through it. I'm going to give you a chance to start, and then I will read it out loud, because I know some people it's important to hear things as well as reading it. So I'll give you a chance to start, but then I will read it. And then what I'd like us to do, because we have such a small group today, it may be helpful to first individually work through it, but then let's talk about it as the group that we have today instead of breaking into small groups. But what I'd like you to do is read the case, go through the multidimensional model, the blank version that I have for you in the Google Doc. It's on the second page, and it maps, it outlines the 4 different types of broaching statements. And then I'd like for you to give an example. What's something that you'd like to explore, a question that you have, a statement that you'd like to make to our client that matches with each different broaching type. Okay. Whew. Didn't know you're getting an assignment today, right? But we've got some time. I really want us to work through this. I'm going to come back and talk about it as a large group. This may also be your opportunity to take a quick break, because I know we didn't take a break halfway. So if you'd like to run to the restroom or grab some water, please do so now. And then we're going to come back and chat. Okay. All right, everyone. We'll just give us a moment to pop back in. Thank you. All right, hopefully you had a chance to take care of yourselves and take a bit of a break. We'll also begin to visit our case. But what I have, I think you should be seeing the case up on the screen, and you also have access to it on your own if you scan the QR code. So because I'm going to scroll through it as I read it, but if you need to move back or adjust on your own, you can do so. So I'll read through the case of Margot. Margot is a 39-year-old multiracial woman. She came to counseling after a monumental and very public period of transition in her life. In the past, the client mentioned that she described herself as, quote, racially ambiguous, as she believed that it might be beneficial to her acting career. She further explained that after a few years in Hollywood, she met and fell in love with a white man, Hudson, who is now in the public eye. Hudson is from a very wealthy and powerful family with ties to international royalty. As they fell in love and the public followed their relationship, Margot was constantly confronted with other people's ideas, fears, and judgments about her interracial relationship. While publicly, Margot rarely referenced her interracial heritage, she noted she has close relationships with her mother and her side of the family, who are African American. Her father, who is white, divorced from her mother when she was younger. Currently, Margot and her father have a strained and distant relationship. It was a whirlwind courtship, and Margot found herself leaving the United States, to move overseas to be closer to Hudson, his work responsibilities, and his family. As Margot and Hudson planned their wedding, it became apparent that the public's concerns about their relationship also were shared by Hudson's family. Hudson's family had private conversations about how to distance themselves from the couple and their interracial child. Margot believed that she was treated differently than other individuals who married into the family due to her multiracial heritage. She also noted that she felt unprotected, silenced, trapped, alone, and unable to ask for help because she feared how it might reflect on their powerful family. Forced to try to manage her feelings of sadness, anxiety, and fear alone, she began to withdraw. She only did public appearances when necessary. She put on a happy face when she was in the public eye, but at home, she stated that she was miserable and even had thoughts of ending her life. These thoughts scared Margot, and she disclosed them to Hudson and asked for help. However, she felt further silenced by her family, who shamed her for seeking help. The couple blamed Hudson's family for being complicit in the public slander and unfair treatment. After many futile attempts to resolve their issue privately, the couple finally decided that the only way for them to live a healthy and well life was to get space and move further away from Hudson's family. Margot and Hudson moved to the United States after a few months of getting settled, Margot realized that while she felt emotionally stable, she still needed to process her experiences as a multiracial woman in the public eye, her family-strained relationship, her plans for raising a multiracial child, her beliefs about self, and racial identity. So, whew, this is a long case, but what are your thoughts about the case so far? Does that sound familiar? I see some nodding heads here. Okay. Yes, it might sound familiar. But as we begin to look at the multidimensional model of broaching behavior, and remember, we went through the 4 dimensions, starting with intra-counseling. Our goal here today, with the time that we have left, think about statements that might be important, wonderings, counselor statements or questions. But before we do that, I'm going to switch back to this screen so you can see my discussion question. So what stands out to you about Margot's story?
If I didn't know the real life context of it, I would have a hard time believing this is real, because I feel like in general, interracial relationships aren't as stigmatized anymore. It would seem like an outdated story to me, but I know that it's still happening because this is a real story.
Yes. All I did was took the details that were in the media about Meghan and Harry's story and changed it to Margot and Henry. So I mean, we don't know how much of this, all we know is what we've heard, right? And so I fictionalized it and put it together for us. But yeah, so that's interesting. You said, what stood out to you as an acknowledgement of how outdated it feels. Okay. Other thoughts?
Something that stood out to me, I could be off on this, so please tell me if I am. Okay. But even in the very beginning, as she was talking about her story and what she's been working with, Margot said that she was racially ambiguous because she felt it would help her acting career. So that kind of infers to me that she would feel judged if she actually expressed how she felt or how she identified. So it's not just these recent events that she's having trouble with, but it's a lifetime of struggles that are here.
Absolutely. So cultural identity, racial identity development, I think I hear all those things will be important to explore if you were Margot's counselor, and learning what were those experiences like for her? How did she progress through her identity development? And were there key things that happened, like notable experiences that helped her kind of land where she is now? Yeah, you're right. I think that does signal there's more to this story than just recent events and hearing from externally what the problems were or what her family saw as conflicts. There are also some things internally that that Margot, because we're speaking about Margot, we don't know about Meghan, but as Margot, it could signal that we need to do some exploration around racial identity. Yeah. That's good. What else? I can click back for us so we can see it. I know there's a lot. So I think about different identity factors and how there might be important discussions about the intersections of those. So 39-year-old woman, grew up in the US, so nation of origin, but also experiencing what it was like to live in a different country and kind of be kind of thrown into the socialization or the expectations of rules, behaviors, requirements there. So there's lots of different layers here. Right? What other identity factors might be important to check in around?
She's also a mother, so parenthood probably plays a role in that.
Your head. So there's some definitely that identity, gender. You know, what perhaps was there? So, was there any socialization around what it means to be, how she identifies, racially ambiguous or Black woman, multiracial woman, and a parent, or what? How does she see her role there? So the intersections of those. Other thoughts? Oh, seeking help, help-seeking behaviors. There's a lot there. So you might have a lot of questions, a lot of things that are swirling in your mind as, and if you really were Margot's counselor, this is interesting because although we don't know what she's doing at this point, but my guess is she's probably sought some counseling. So you might actually get a case this dynamic, right? So you could get this, and then what do you do here? How do you help her explore all of these issues that are kind of weaved in together here? So let's start with intercounseling. If you were to broach some topics related to your dynamic as who you are with Margot as who she is, what might be important to explore?
Are we talking about specifically identifying differences between the counselor and I think a really big one is there was a lot of public pressure and outside pressure on Margot's relationship and everything therein. And the average person, I think it's safe to say, you know, there's not magazine articles written about it, and there's not entire countries analyzing every behavior. So I think that's a pretty huge difference.
Okay, yeah. So just acknowledging how being in the public eye her experience of being in the public eye is very different than your own. So you might have your lens might reflect that. Yeah. Any other differences that might come to mind? It could be as simple as noting that there could be cultural differences, racial or ethnic differences, how you identify or how the world perceives you, right?
I mean, there's a whole list of differences between me and Margot. I am not racially ambiguous at all. I identify as a white woman. I've never lived in another country. I'm not married. I'm not a mom. All of those things are just very simple. Even like my parents are still married. So that's a difference as well.
Yeah. Wow. So there could be some things you could definitely acknowledge as appropriate, as you felt it was necessary and important to the work. But you could make some statements that just acknowledge those differences and convey that it's okay for Margot to talk about all of that stuff with you in that space. I also like this. I'm going to read this bullet here because I think it's important. Divest yourself of expert status. So sometimes our clients will see us that way, no matter how we identify. But if we're able to say, like, look, this is my lens, and this is how I might see things, or my questions might be coming from this space, but I'm not an expert, right? Only you can be an expert on your own life, and I want to learn from you. Like, if you make a statement like that, that could be helpful. It also distances you from a perceived attachment to a perceived system. So depending on where you work, for example, or even just your role as a counselor, your clients might view you as just another extension of the system that you belong to. Like, well, because you're a counselor, you're going to be doing the bidding of DSS or the bidding of who referred them to you. And that's not necessarily true. So divesting and separating can be important. Just identifying yourself as like, hey, this is just me. Right? I'm Cassie. I'm Dominique, right? That's it.
I
Okay.
could see for someone who identifies as multiracial or racially ambiguous, them seeing someone who is of one race or ethnic identity primarily as more of an expert, especially if it overlaps with one of her identities. So a woman who identifies as Black and only Black, she might find as more of an expert in that racial dynamic, even though they're not necessarily.
That's true. Yeah, that's an important dynamic to highlight and to bring that into the space. And you can give, it really gives permission for Margot to talk about that. That's great. What about intra-individual? So if we move down another dimension, this is the counselor's acknowledgement of the confluence of identity dimensions that operate, such as race, gender, class, socioeconomic status, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, immigrant status, and occupation. How might we do that with Margot? I think with Margot, because her case is so dynamic, I mean, it's like she's definitely bringing in like a lot of those issues right up front. And often when our clients come in, it probably won't be as kind of as in your face as this is, so to speak, right? Like as clear. So for Margot, it might be as simple as just acknowledging, hey, I see that you occupy many different social locations and identities. You might not want to use that language, but I sometimes, even if it's helpful, I know some clients like to see things and it's helpful for them to be able to look things up later. So we might even draw out identity statuses, like asking a question, how do you identify? Or asking them to do an activity with me where they in some way describe themselves. And then we can go through each identity and talk about how all of their identities might intersect in some way, and how the salience of each identity might depend on where they are or who's watching or what experience they're going through. So my guess is, I don't know, and this could be, I'm taking a shot in the dark, so to speak, but perhaps Margot's identity as a biracial woman wasn't as salient to her until she started dating Henry. And then when she moved overseas, it became even more salient. So just acknowledging that there are ebbs and flows in how she may view herself or what may be of central importance, making space to talk about all of that hopefully gives her room to say, well, yeah, like all these things are important to me, but at times I'm noticing that I am much more stressed about this or this or this, so it gives her a space to really get in there and unpack on her own. I think there's many different ways to do that, but yeah. Any other thoughts? How would you do that?
I really liked the idea of drawing it out, so to speak. For me personally, it would help me keep track of all of these different dynamics are going on, so I don't overlook anything. But I think it would be helpful to someone in that situation to see, okay, so this is this identity, let's draw lines to every other identity. And then it's a very useful tool in seeing the domino effect of everything.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think doing that can really help you out when you get to some of the other dimensions of this model, like perhaps even as we move down, intra REC, like as you've got that mapped out, then you can start to see, are there overlapping isms that this person is experiencing? And the weight of that, you can talk about all of that. So, I think that'd be really cool to do. And how normalizing that would be for a client to see it, to be like, this is why I feel so exhausted. Mm-hmm. Give space. So what are you taking away? So I know in our discussion, we didn't specifically write down counselor statements or questions. As you practice something like this, I might recommend that you try doing that. So even if you on your own find a case study as a practice tool, use this blank model and think through, okay, if I were really that person's counselor, what would I say? How would I phrase that? Because sometimes the phrasing is where we get stuck. Like we know there's a strand, there's a thread we want to pull on, but we often get stuck with how to say it. And I just want to say that's okay. It's okay to get stuck. It's okay to muddle through it and for it to feel awkward. I think what's most important is that you tried it though, because your client is going to recognize, okay, my counselor sees that this is important and they at least tried to go there. And if anything, maybe it just helps build rapport. Like, yeah, I've really been sitting with something and I'm hearing all of these connections, but I'm not quite sure how to weave them all together. But here's what I'm thinking. You can go down the list and use a self-involving statement. I do that a lot because sometimes I'm in my head, I'm like, I don't know how to say that. But if you can walk through, like break it down out loud while the client's sitting there, they can at least hear your logic and they can help you weave it together, right? Which actually might be more beneficial for them versus me trying to make all the connections and then spitting it out for them. Like if they say, yep, oh, you're right, that is an important point. Here's how I think it's important. And they make that statement on their own, then we can both talk about it. Yeah. Any thoughts or questions? I'm going to switch back to my processing here. This might be the biggest question that we might have the most discussion around. What challenges might you have with working with Margot? So with all of those dimensions, with all of that stuff that we just talked about, you get this person, they walk through your door. What you thinking? Like, where it might be some of the barriers to broaching or challenges that you'd have.
For me, I think, especially because she is in the public eye, separating my previous perceptions of her from what she's presenting in the counseling room. That's not something you often encounter with clients, especially because you're not supposed to have dual relationships. And so you're supposed to avoid that as much as possible. But having a dual relationship of knowing her as a public figure and knowing her as a client is kind of unavoidable.
Yes. Okay, so beginning to separate what she's saying, just knowing her as the person that she's presenting herself to you as versus what you could read or what you already know. Other challenges.
Sabrina said, separating the healthy curiosity that is connected to broaching from being nosy because she's a celebrity.
Okay. Yeah. So how would you know what's healthy curiosity? What can actually help you contribute to your conceptualization of this client? What might be beneficial for your relationship versus, what's just juicy gossip? How would you know? How might you know that?
I think that's something I would have to seek supervision on because I don't know if I could keep myself in check.
Sure. That might be one of those things where you realize it after you make a mistake. Like, oh, that was a question too far, or that was mainly for me versus the client. Or maybe if you can just keep that in the back of your mind, like, okay, what is driving this curiosity? Do I want to know this because, I want to, I'm so invested already in the Mario and Henry story, or does this actually contribute to the conceptualization that I have with the client? And perhaps that's where theory can help you. I think theory provides a nice container for those types of questions, right? So if we know we're using feminist therapy, for example, so feminists, we might be guided by exploring some of the historical impacts or relationship factors, power dynamics. So if what we're wanting to know fits nicely within that container, great. But if we're asking things that don't fit in that container, then perhaps we've strayed a little bit out of bounds. I think we probably also are building on top of some of the common challenges that we mentioned earlier in the presentation, like that I'm not sure, what if I'm wrong, those things. I think those things are always present, or they might always be present. In addition to, in this specific case, we've got some very unique challenges related to celebrity and wanting to make sure that we are respecting boundaries here.
Sabrina said needing to brush up on that particular British culture as well as family system or systems in history.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I don't know a lot about British culture. So that would be one of my areas as well, where I would say, okay, I mean, every time there's a royal wedding, for example, there's lots on the news, but that's very, very little do I know about day-to-day life or culture related to British culture. So I would probably do my own reading, check in with people that I knew. I like watching videos, find something that might help contribute and give me a broader sense of knowledge so that perhaps I could really get to more of the salient Margot specific questions rather than her educating me on what British culture is. Right. So that's another, I think, good indicator. If you're noticing yourself spending time like getting the basics and not learning the salience of that to the client, that's how you know that you need to go back and do some of your own research. Mm-hmm. And I know already I would need to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So any other thoughts, y'all? So I'll broaden this up a little bit as we begin to close here. We walked through a case. We talked about how we might apply the multidimensional model of broaching behaviors. We learned about steps, phases of broaching, and talked also a bit about exploring cultural values and understanding how values and biases are absolutely culture bound, recognizing how to identify those culture bound values and when they might pop up in our work. So we've done a lot already this morning. What are general thoughts, questions, things that you'd like to talk about as we begin to close? And I could also throw out this question: what will you take away from the time that we spent together?
I will just say that I am very grateful that I attended this session and that I got to hear what you had to say, because it's very insightful. I had some serious self-reflection to do, and it was very interesting to apply all this to, day-to-day life and my lifestyle in general. So to be completely honest, I'm still a student, so I'm not practicing, but I think it was an incredible opportunity to have this in my mind as I continue through my program.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. And I also heard that there's some self-reflection that you're excited to do, and that makes me excited. So yes, I continue to encourage that, and just know that it's a lifelong process. It doesn't stop when you graduate. This is always, and that's to be expected. We want you to do that, and hopefully you're hearing that in your program as well. And I'm even more excited that you attended as a student. It shows your dedication to the field and growing and adding to your repertoire. So thanks.
Yeah, I'm a student as well, so
Oh, cool.
I'm excited that I'm getting to this early. Sabrina said, what additional training or readings would you recommend to strengthen this skill?
Ooh, I actually have a list that I plan to share with you all. So hopefully that will give you some places to start. But I would definitely suggest starting with reading about cultural humility and broaching. Anything that you can find about cultural competence, going back to those foundational documents that you probably have heard a little bit more about, either in your programs or at some point. So the multicultural social justice counseling competencies, going back and revisiting those and really getting a sense of what this means for your work at this point. Going back to the multicultural counseling competencies. And I would also say racial identity development. So there are a number of racial identity development models that differ based on identity. So there's a model for people of color. There's a model for multiracial individuals. There's a model, a lot of them that you can find. There's even cultural identity development models. There are identity development models for different experiences or identities, like oh goodness, trans identity, gay identity. There's a ton of them, and familiarize yourself with them. Oh, there's also another one for ability. So check those out, learn what they are, and save them right on your computer. Have those links somewhere so that they're easy to find. I find myself using them a lot in my work. They're tools that can help normalize clients' experiences and then give you both of you, lots of language to draw on when you're in session, right? So there's a number of those more academic resources that you can find that really add more grist to the mill for your work when you're sitting with clients. Definitely pull in the racial identity or identity development models and understand how you can use those. So I would start there. That's a lot already. That's a great question. Thank you so much, Sabrina. Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, it feels like we're at a stopping place, and I really appreciate this group. We had a small group today, but I'm so excited about your participation and all the things that we talked about. I can feel your excitement for counseling and how dedicated you are to the field, and I'm hopeful that we'll continue to learn and grow together. And hopefully I'll be able to see you again at some point, maybe at a conference or someplace else. I do have my contact information here on the last slide for you so that you can reach out to me, contact me. I have my practice location, my information listed there, and then some of my social media handles. So only an email away. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your attendance.